Okay, let's unpack this. A war with only, what, about 6,000 American casualties? I mean, that sounds like a relatively small conflict, doesn't it?
On the surface, yeah.
Yeah.
But the War of 1812, despite that seemingly low number for the U.S., had these unexpectedly massive ripple effects.
Absolutely. It dramatically shaped the future for the United States, for Canada, and certainly for Native American populations.
Hugely.
So, the big question we're diving into today is how could a war that seems, well, kind of minor in some ways, have such a lasting continental impact?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Often the scale of a conflict, like in terms of immediate casualties, it doesn't always capture the whole picture of its long-term significance.
Right.
And the War of 1812, as we'll explore, is just a perfect example of that.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into in this deep dive. We've got some really insightful historical excerpts here. They give a pretty structured overview of the whole period.
Yeah, they lay it out nicely.
Our mission really is to cut through any potential confusion, avoid getting bogged down, and pull out the most crucial insights, those aha moments that explain why this war, often overshadowed, is so vital for understanding North American history.
hmm
You're looking for clarity, for conciseness, and, well, that's what we aim to deliver. Sifting through it all to get to the core story.
And if you think about the timeline, the War of 1812 sits at this really interesting point. It's post-revolution, obviously, but it's before the big internal conflicts like the Civil War that would define the later 19th century in the U.S.
Good point.
So understanding its roots, its outcomes, it provides really critical context for, well, everything that came after.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're talking about James Madison's presidency. He took office in 1809. Now, the source material points out he was very much in the Jeffersonian mold. What does that tell us about the political climate right before the war?
Ah, that's a key starting point, yeah. Madison's Jeffersonian leanings, they meant a continued focus on agrarianism, agriculture as the economic bedrock, and this kind of deep suspicion of centralized power.
Okay.
And this philosophy, it directly impacted how they viewed things like needing a strong standing army or a national bank. They preferred a much more decentralized approach.
Right. Less federal power.
Exactly. And those preferences, they'd have real consequences as war started looking more likely.
Right. And speaking of what was looming, the U.S. was really grappling with these ongoing trade restrictions. We had the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809.
Which, as the source reminds us, restricted trade with Britain and France, but allowed it with everyone else. Bit complicated.
Yeah, but that was set to expire. So what was the next move in this economic chess game?
Well, it raises that classic question, doesn't it? How effective is economic pressure
Huh.
really as a diplomatic tool?
Hmm.
So the Non-Intercourse Act expires, and it leads to Macon's Bill Number 2 in 1810. The idea here was quite strategic, or at least it looked that way on paper.
How so?
It basically offered to resume trade with both Britain and France, kind of as bait. The U.S. essentially promised, okay, whoever lifts their restrictions on our shipping first, we'll trade with you, and we'll put restrictions back on the other guy.
Ah, trying to play them off each other.
Exactly. You see the early republic trying to use its economic muscle, as a diplomatic lever, a strategy with, let's say, mixed results throughout history.
Look, tender Napoleon.
No.
Always looking for an angle, right? The source highlights how he saw this as a chance maybe to drag the U.S. into a fight with Britain. So what was his play?
Classic Napoleon. With his usual cunning, she announces in August 1810 that the French decrees against American shipping, they'd been revoked.
But was it genuine?
Well, whether he actually intended to follow through is highly questionable, but Madison felt he didn't have much choice but to take him at his word, or seem to.
Okay.
So he then gives Britain 3 months to do the same, or the U.S. would slap those trade restrictions back on them.
And the British reaction to this ultimatum, I mean, they couldn't have trusted Napoleon much.
Not at all. You're right. Britain was understandably very skeptical about Napoleon's sincerity. They basically said, look, the U.S. needs to lift its restrictions on us first, and only when France genuinely and completely removes all its restrictions will we budge.
They weren't buying it.
They had very good reason not to. His intentions, as the source confirms, were indeed less than truthful.
So this diplomatic back and forth is going nowhere fast. And then a new force emerges, the Warhawks, in the 12th Congress, late 1811. Tell us about them. They sound, well, more aggressive.
Oh, absolutely. The Warhawks, they really represented a shift in American politics. They were generally younger guys, mostly from the South and the West,
Okay.
intensely nationalistic. They hadn't lived through the Revolution themselves, but they kind of craved that same glory, a stronger assertion of American power on the world stage.
Any key names we should know?
Definitely. Figures like Henry Clay from Kentucky, he actually became Speaker of the House, and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, big players.
And a major issue for these Western war hawks, according to our source, was this ongoing resistance from Native American tribes to, well, westward expansion. The Battle of Tippecanoe, November 1811, gets mentioned as pretty significant here. What was going on?
Yeah, for those Western war hawks, the fact that Native American tribes were still resisting American expansion was a huge sticking point. They really wanted to remove what they saw as an obstacle to settlement. Now, Tecumseh, who was a really highly respected Shawnee leader and strategist, along with his brother known as the Prophet, they've been working hard to unite various tribes into this powerful confederacy east of the Mississippi.
A unified front.
Exactly. Tecumseh's vision was all about fair land dealings. He argued that land belonged to all the tribes collectively. It couldn't just be sold off by individual groups.
And the Americans suspected the British were involved helping these tribes.
Oh, strongly. Precisely. There was this widespread belief that the British were actively giving support, maybe weapons, to these tribes, encouraging them to resist. So against that backdrop, you have General William Henry Harrison leading about 1,000 men to confront the main Indian headquarters at Tippecanoe in what's now Indiana.
And the battle itself.
Well, the battle, while maybe not a clear-cut military win for Harrison, it definitely weakened Tecumseh's Confederacy. And, as the source notes, it kind of spurred on westward expansion even more by pushing the tribes further west. Made the Warhawks feel justified, perhaps.
So Tippecanoe definitely ramps up the tension, but the Warhawks had other reasons for pushing towards war too, didn't they? Canada seems like a big target.
Oh, absolutely. Canada was central. The Warhawks saw an opportunity because Britain was so tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe.
They thought Britain was distracted.
Exactly. They figured conquering Canada would be relatively easy, and doing that would, one, eliminate the perceived British support for native resistance, and two, maybe add some valuable territory to the U.S.
And it wasn't just Canada, right? The source mentions Florida, too.
Right. Southern expansionists, as the source points out, also had their eyes on Spanish Florida. Spain was an ally of Britain at the time, so it kind of fit into the same anti-British picture.
And we can't forget the old grievances, the maritime issues, British impressment of American sailors, the orders in council hitting American exports. Those were still huge sources of anger, weren't they?
Oh, massive, constant sources of frustration. Impressment, the British Navy just grabbing sailors off American ships, was seen as a blatant violation of American sovereignty. Outrageous.
Yeah.
And the orders in council, those British trade rules aimed at France, they really hammered American trade with Europe. Especially hurt the farmers in the southern states, their agricultural exports.
But not everyone was beating the war drum. Our source mentions Daniel Webster, a Federalist from New Hampshire, arguing against it. What was his perspective based on?
Webster, yeah, he spoke for the New England manufacturing and commercial interests. He argued pretty eloquently that going to war with Britain, the major trading partner, would be, well, terrible for their economy.
Makes sense for his constituents.
Totally. And it's interesting, the source notes his connection to Chief Justice John Marshall. Apparently, Webster even helped draft some of Marshall's big Supreme Court opinions, so he had serious intellectual weight.
Despite voices like Webster's, the U.S. declares war in June 1812. But it wasn't a unified country going into this, was it?
No, far from it. As the source really highlights, there was significant opposition, especially from those pro-British Federalist states in New England and parts of the Mid-Atlantic, too.
So internal division right from the start.
Yeah, and that division would be a major headache for the American war effort. It really shows you how fragile national unity can be in wartime, how regional interests can clash with federal policy, sometimes even threatening the whole Union.
It is pretty striking, though, that the U.S. picks Britain to fight when France had also been seizing ships and messing with trade. The source gives a few reasons why Britain became the target. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. First, there was this kind of historical tilt among Republicans towards France, remembering their help during the Revolution. Gratitude, maybe.
Okay, legacy.
Second, the British actions, especially impressment and the whole army and the Indians thing,
Right.
they just felt more visible, more direct.
Right.
They affected more Americans personally.
More tangible grievances.
Exactly. And then there was the Chesapeake Leopard affair a few years earlier, where a British warship fired on a U.S. frigate.
Yeah.
That really stoked anti-British anger.
Right, that was a big incident.
And finally, let's be honest, there was the lure of British Canada. Timber, fishing, fur trade. Valuable resources right next door.
Hmm.
Opportunity.
So a mix of history, direct insults, and maybe a bit of opportunism pushed the U.S. towards Britain. But these resentful New Englanders, the source really drives home how much they hampered the U.S. war effort. How did their opposition actually play out?
Yeah, this is crucial for understanding why the war was so tough for the U.S.
Yeah.
New England Federalists mostly saw the war as, frankly, unnecessary
Yeah.
and bad for business.
Bad for their business.
Right. They felt the complaints against Britain were maybe overblown,
Hmm.
and they still didn't trust France. Remember, their merchants had been making money from trade before the war, and they really opposed grabbing Canada. They worried it would just add more agrarian states, more Republican power, and dilute their own political influence.
So self-interest played a big part.
A huge part. Some New England investors probably put more money into helping Britain financially than their own government. And New England farmers kept selling supplies to Canada, which, directly helped the British, even helped their invasion of New York.
Wow. Selling to the enemy, essentially.
Pretty much. And maybe the biggest thing, several New England governors just flat out refused to let their state militias fight outside their own state borders.
Seriously.
Yeah, that massively limited the federal government's ability to actually wage the war effectively.
Yeah.
Talk about disunity.
Wow. Yeah. That level of internal opposition certainly paints a picture of the massive challenges the U.S. faced right from the get-go. Okay, so let's shift to the key events of the war itself. The source starts with an overview, calling it a small war, casualty-wise for Americans, about 6,000 killed or wounded. It also notes that mostly Canadian forces fought the Americans, not huge numbers of British regulars initially.
Right, Britain was focused on Napoleon.
And surprisingly, it's described as one of America's poorest fought wars on land, marked by a failed invasion of Canada. Even the burning of Washington, D.C. sounds like a rough start for the Americans.
In many ways, yeah, the war was a real struggle for the U.S., especially early on. The military was just not ready.
Unprepared.
Totally. And that initial strategy, invading Canada, a complete failure. Bad planning, bad execution. The burning of Washington was, well, deeply humiliating for the young country.
I can imagine.
And the British came dangerously close to grabbing significant territory in New York and New England. That national disunity, the Federalist opposition, it certainly didn't help matters.
But it wasn't all American failures, was it? The source does mention some key victories. The U.S. Navy on the Great Lakes,
Crucial.
Andrew Jackson's big win down in New Orleans,
Hugely symbolic.
and William Henry Harrison's earlier successes, too. Ultimately, it's called a stalemate, but one where America somehow gained diplomatic and military respect. It's even called the Second War for Independence.
That's complex, isn't it?
Yeah, and it mentions the Federalists fading away, maybe less sectionalism for a while, but also devastating losses for Native Americans and a boost for American industry because trade got cut off. That's a lot of contradictory outcomes from a small war.
It really is. While the land war was often messy and indecisive, the U.S. Navy pulled off critical wins on the Great Lakes. Those were strategically vital for controlling that whole region.
Okay.
And Jackson's victory at New Orleans, even though it happened after the peace treaty was signed, which is bizarre, it had this enormous impact on American morale, national identity.
Right, the timing is crazy.
And Harrison's earlier wins, like Tippecanoe, they definitely boosted his political career later. The war did kind of accidentally foster a greater sense of national unity in some ways, even while exposing those deep divisions.
And the Federalists.
Their decline was a major long-term consequence, as was the fact that the U.S. had to start making more stuff itself because British goods weren't coming in.
Boosted industry.
Right. But, and this is crucial, as this source rightly emphasizes, the impact on Native American populations was just devastating. Huge loss of life, huge loss of land.
Let's dig into that American unpreparedness a bit more.
Yeah.
The source lists several things. The economy was already weak from trade restrictions.
Yep.
The National Bank's charter had expired, making financing the war really hard.
Big problem.
The regular army was tiny, relying on poorly trained state militias.
Who often didn't want to leave their own states, as we said.
Right, and Britain just had this vastly superior navy imposing a blockade. Even Jefferson's little gunboats, the Mosquito fleet, were apparently useless. So it sounds like the U.S. was really starting behind the eight ball.
Completely. The trade policies beforehand had weakened the U.S. financially. No national bank meant scrambling for funds. The small army was no match for experienced British troops, and the militia system was, frankly, unreliable for a national war, and that British Navy dominated the seas, choked off American ports with the blockade, That hurt the economy even more and just fueled more opposition to the war back home.
And that initial U.S. plan attacked Canada. The source calls it a strategic failure. Says the U.S. mistakenly thought Canadians would just, what, welcome them with open arms?
Yeah, a serious miscalculation.
Yeah.
They underestimated Canadian loyalty, especially since many in Upper Canada were actually loyalists or their descendants from the Revolution.
Ah, right. Didn't want another round with the U.S.
Pretty much. And the source also suggests that if the U.S. had focused its attack on Montreal, it might have changed everything. Why was Montreal so important?
Well, Montreal was the main hub, the
Ugh.
logistical center, the supply line for all of Upper Canada.
Um.
Capturing it could have basically cut off British control over the whole region. Might have led to a very different war. Instead, American attacks were kind of scattered, poorly coordinated along that huge border.
A missed opportunity, perhaps. Okay, so the fight for the Great Lakes. This seems like a really crucial turning point. The source explains the British couldn't easily get their big ships past Niagara Falls,
Right, that physical barrier.
which led to this intense shipbuilding race right there on the lakes. And then Oliver Hazard Perry comes along, builds a fleet super fast on Lake Erie in 1813,
Yeah, quite the feat.
and wins a decisive victory against the British that September. That sounds like it really shifted the momentum.
Oh, it was absolutely pivotal. Perry's shipbuilding effort was incredible, and that win on Lake Erie was critical.
How so?
It basically cut off British supply lines on the lake and forced the British Army in that area to retreat.
Okay, force them back.
Yeah, and that retreat led directly to General William Henry Harrison catching them at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813, near modern-day Toronto. And that's where Tecumseh was killed.
The end of that pan-Indian alliance.
Exactly. Tecumseh's death effectively dissolved that major Native American confederacy in the Northwest, a huge strategic gain for the U.S. Then, 1814. Napoleon's defeated in Europe. Suddenly, Britain can send more troops and ships to North America. The source mentions a planned British invasion down through New York, along the Hudson River Valley. Sounds serious.
Very serious. A potential repeat of the Saratoga campaign strategy from the Revolution.
But then, another naval battle. Thomas MacDonough wins a crucial victory on Lake Champlain near Plattsburgh in September 1814. The source even compares it to Saratoga. What made MacDonough's win so vital?
MacDonough's victory against what looked like a stronger British fleet was absolutely essential for the Americans.
Why is essential?
It forced the British to just abandon that whole invasion plan for New York and pull back into Canada. It basically saved Upper New York, stopped the British from pushing into New England. And just like Saratoga convinced the French to join the Revolution, MacDonough's win had a huge impact on the peace talks that were already happening in Europe. It really strengthened the American negotiating hand.
And then we get the really dramatic part. Washington, D.C. burned by the British, August 1814. Retaliation, the source says, for the Americans burning York, Toronto earlier. President Madison himself had to flee. Sounds like utter chaos.
It was a deeply embarrassing moment, no doubt. A British force just sailed up the Chesapeake, met pretty weak resistance, and then just set fire to most of the public buildings. The Capitol, the White House.
Unbelievable.
It really starkly showed how vulnerable the U.S. Capitol was and how unprepared the military was, at least in that part of the country.
But the British didn't have it all their own way on the coast. They were stopped at Fort McHenry, near Baltimore. And this, of course, is where Francis Scott Key gets inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So even amid disaster, moments of, I guess, national symbolism emerge.
Precisely. The defense of Baltimore was a huge morale boost. Fort McHenry held out against this intense British naval bombardment all night.
Right.
And seeing the American flag still flying over the fort the next morning, that became this incredibly powerful, enduring symbol of American resilience, captured perfectly in Key's poem, which becomes the national anthem eventually.
No, let's swing down south. Andrew Jackson's campaigns in the Southwest and his famous victory at New Orleans. The source mentions the British plan to grab the Gulf Coast and New Orleans.
Control the Mississippi.
Right. And the attack on Fort Mims by the Red Sticks, a faction of the Creek Indians, followed by Jackson's really brutal retaliatory campaign. It culminates in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, described as the largest single massacre of Native Americans in U.S. history.
That's a really dark part of this story.
It absolutely is. Jackson's campaigns down there were marked by extreme violence, a relentless push for American expansion, often with, frankly, little regard for Native American lives or rights.
The attack on Fort Mims was horrific, yes. But Jackson's response at Horseshoe Bend effectively shattered the Creek Confederacy and just forcibly opened up huge areas of land for American settlement, a devastating cost for the indigenous people.
Then comes the Battle of New Orleans. January 1815. The source points out the incredible irony. The peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, had already been signed 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah, but news traveled slow. No email back then.
Right, so technically the battle didn't need to happen. But Jackson crushes this direct British assault. Huge American victory, massive boost to American pride.
Oh, enormous. Over 2,000 British casualties to maybe 70 American losses. It was incredibly lopsided.
Wow.
And despite the timing, the psychological impact was immense. Jackson became an instant national hero. The win fueled this widespread feeling of triumph, this popular, though not quite accurate belief that this battle won the war.
It overshadowed the earlier problems.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the source does suggest that if the British had won at New Orleans, they might have tried to demand more concessions in the final treaty ratification, even though it was already signed. So maybe it mattered practically, too.
Interesting. Okay, what about the war at sea overall? The source says it was mostly fought on the lakes because the U.S. just didn't have many big warships for the ocean.
Right. Couldn't really challenge the Royal Navy head-on out there.
But it highlights the skill of American crews, some surprising early wins against British warships, and American privateers were apparently really effective, like in the Revolution.
Yeah, very effective. Similar to the Revolution, these privately owned armed ships did a lot of damage to British merchant shipping, caused real economic pain back in Britain, put pressure on Parliament to end the war.
But the British hit back with that crippling blockade and coastal raids. That caused major economic hardship, even bankruptcy in the U.S., right?
Absolutely. So the naval war was complicated. The U.S. Navy and privateers scored some points, disrupted trade, definitely annoyed the British. But that British blockade was powerful. It hammered the U.S. economy, created serious internal problems, and just fueled more dissent, especially in New England. A real back and forth.
Okay, so finally, the war ends with the Treaty of Ghent in late 1814. The source describes it as basically an armistice. Like, okay, everybody stop fighting, give back any territory you captured.
Pretty much status quo ante bellum, back to how things were before the war.
Notably, it doesn't resolve any of the original U.S. complaints, like impressment. Nothing.
Yeah.
Yet Americans were apparently thrilled, just glad not to have lost territory.
Yeah, exactly. The treaty didn't really address the causes of the war, which is why some historians debate whether you can even call it an American victory.
Right.
But for a country that had its capital burned, faced serious military setbacks, just ending the fighting and not losing territory felt like a win. Relief, maybe.
And they did keep fishing rights off Canada, which was something, I guess.
A minor point, but yeah, something tangible they held on to. So, not a resolution of grievances, but an end to the conflict that was largely accepted, even celebrated in the U.S.
So the fighting stops, but the fallout continues. Let's look at the domestic aftermath, starting with that very politically charged Hartford Convention, December 1814 to January 1815.
Right, just as the war is ending.
The source paints this picture of intense opposition to the war in New England. Federalists, even some Republicans, almost beat Madison in the 1812 election. And as the war dragged on, these New England dissenters got louder. What was the main goal of this Hartford Convention?
It was really a direct result of that deep unhappiness in New England about the war. You had delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, plus some from New Hampshire and Vermont. They got together to air their grievances, basically, and demand help from the federal government.
Help in what way?
Well, their immediate, most urgent need was money. Financial assistance from Washington, because the British blockade had just devastated New England's economy, which was so reliant on shipping and trade.
And there were even whispers about secession, right, leaving the Union. Though the source says the moderates won out over the radicals on that.
Yeah, talk of secession was definitely in the air, floated by the most extreme voices. But the moderates managed to keep that off the table.
But they did propose some pretty major changes to the Constitution. Things like ending the 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved people towards representation for Southern states.
Which boosted Southern power, yeah.
Requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress for embargoes, for admitting new Western states, for declaring war, limiting the president to one term, even blocking naturalized citizens from holding federal office. These seem clearly aimed at curbing the power of the South and the Republicans.
Oh, absolutely. Those proposed amendments, they directly reflected the Federalists' deep anxieties about the growing political clout of the South and the Republican Party. They wanted to rebalance power in the Union, protect New England's interests.
A power play, essentially.
You could say that. It really highlights, again, how fragile unity was, how regional fears could lead to attempts to fundamentally alter the rules of the game.
And then the timing is just incredible. Massachusetts sends envoys to Washington with these demands,
Right, ready to lay down the law.
only to find out that Jackson has won this stunning victory at New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent has already been signed, ending the war. Talk about bad timing.
Spectacularly bad timing. Couldn't have scripted it worse for them.
The source says the Hartford Resolutions basically became the death knell of the Federalist Party. How did this convention finish them off?
Well, imagine it. These demands arrive right when the country is celebrating this perceived great victory and the end of the war. The Federalists just looked completely out of step, unpatriotic, maybe even treasonous to a lot of Americans.
Optics were terrible.
Awful. And exaggerated stories about the secession talk at the convention didn't help their image either. So in the next presidential election, 1816, their candidate gets crushed by James Monroe. That was basically the end of the Federalists as a major national force.
Wow. And it's an interesting point the source makes that before 1815, New England actually had more talk about nullification and secession than the South did.
Yeah, it's the important historical irony. Their resistance to Jefferson's embargo, their hindering the war effort, those were pretty significant acts of states challenging federal authority well before the Civil War era.
So domestically, the war kills off a major party, maybe strengthens national unity, at least temporarily. What about internationally? What were the legacies? The source mentions a revival of intense American hatred for the British, lasting suspicion. Not too surprising, maybe?
No, understandable after another war. Lingering bitterness.
But it also highlights a boost to Canadian patriotism and nationalism. Some historians even see the war as the birth of the Canadian nation. That's a perspective you don't always hear as much in the U.S.
It's a really crucial point. For Canadians, 1812 is often seen as their defining moment, a successful defense against American expansionism.
Right, they fought them off.
Exactly. It really forged a stronger sense of shared identity, helped to build Canadian nationalism, and the naval arms race in the Great Lakes right after the war shows those tensions were still there, that need for vigilance.
But thankfully, that arms race didn't lead to more fighting. The source mentions the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817. What did that do?
That was a key agreement. It severely limited warships on the Great Lakes for both sides.
Demilitarized the lakes, basically.
Exactly. And that treaty eventually, by the 1870s, led to the longest undefended border in the world between the U.S. and Canada. A pretty remarkable, positive, long-term outcome from all that conflict.
It really is a testament to eventual diplomacy, I suppose.
Yeah, after a lot of distrust, it laid the groundwork for the peaceful relationship we see today.
Finally, the source notes, the war kind of ended American fears about European powers meddling in North America. It fostered a stronger sense of American nationality, independence, and really shifted the country's focus inward towards westward expansion. It's like the war, despite all its struggles, cleared the way for America's continental dreams.
That's a good way to put it. Paradoxically, the war helped solidify American independence, turn its energies towards its own growth. The threat from Britain was diminished. Native American resistance in the East was severely weakened. It just opened up those vast Western territories.
So wrapping this up, this seemingly small war of 1812 was actually a truly pivotal moment. It shaped national identities, totally changed the U.S. political landscape, redefined relationships across North America.
Yeah, huge consequences.
It showed American weaknesses, but also sparked this new sense of unity, this powerful drive west. So hopefully, you now have a much clearer picture of the causes, the key events, the lasting impacts of this often overlooked conflict. Maybe with some surprising details you'll remember.
And bringing it back to that first question, you can really see how a conflict with, a limited death toll for one side can still have these profound, far-reaching consequences for so many different groups.
Absolutely.
The war's impact on Native Americans, the reshaping of U.S. politics, the birth of Canadian nationalism, it all proves that point vividly.
So, here's a final thought for you to chew on. How might the internal divisions, the unexpected twists of the War of 1812, how might they offer insights into the challenges, the triumphs, the surprising turns that nations face throughout history? What other seemingly minor conflicts have had these massive, unexpected, lasting impacts? It's worth thinking about how those historical ripples, often hard to see at the time, continue to shape the world we live in.